This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the Movement for a People's Party. I have a woman who worked with them, and she will be talking about what went on the inside and the outside and why the movement seems to be struggling. Renee Johnston is the woman that you see before you. She's a woman that I met online, and she was once working as a volunteer for the Movement for a People's Party. And we're going to talk a little bit about the movement for the People's Party, its history, its current status, and also some of the problems with leftist movements in this country and why, despite leftist ideas having anywhere from 60 to 70+% approval across the spectrum, we end up with leaders who are right or center-right at best. So anyway, Renee, thank you. Welcome. Is there anything you want to say just about yourself before we start and kick off about the party?
I'm really just a regular person who signed on, trying to make some change, trying to, get some things to happen. I'm based out of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just a regular person. Just a regular person.
Is that New York City or upstate New York? Or?
Yes, New York City.
Yeah, because I mentioned when I had interacted with you online about 30 years ago, I was a Democrat. My dad was an FDR Democrat, a New Deal Democrat, and he was Democratic all his life. He worked for what was the New York City's biggest union there, DC 37, or he worked for the health department, but was represented by that. So he was pretty much what in Europe years ago they would call a good man of the left. But I know that I had some issues when in the late 80s I was volunteering at a local Democratic club, and I won't say which one it was, and it was 1989. David Dinkins was running for mayor. Not that I was such a great fan of Dinkins, but I couldn't stand Ed Koch. But the party club that I was volunteering for, and I had volunteered over numbers of campaigns over a 2 or 3 year period, didn't want David Dinkins to speak. And some of them just came out and said, well, we're not going to let a nigger speak here. Now, this is New York, supposed liberal bastion, late 1980s, late 20th century, and these people were still in that mindset. And it was one of the earliest lessons that I had, that just because someone says that they are liberal doesn't mean that they really are inclusive. Not apropos of the Movement for a People's Party specifically, but have you found that because I assume you've worked or you've volunteered for other groups or whatnot, have you found something similar to that as well?
Yeah, it's difficult because I find that a lot of these progressive spaces, they talk a good game. It's about the talk of uplifting minorities, of hearing marginalized people, of, being a voice for everybody. But if you are one of those voices and you have the audacity to speak out and, within those walls, all of a sudden you're a problem. You're no longer welcomed at the table. They don't really want to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I very found bad is that back in the 80s, I would have described myself as a liberal. Then Reaganism came along and liberalism became a dirty word. And then the people who were liberals decided, well, we're not going to defend the term. We're going to be more like Reagan. So then people would call themselves on the left or progressive. And now sometimes even progressives, the term progressive is getting sort of slagged on. How do you describe yourself politically?
I don't want to term myself as anything specific, because I think that's part of the problem. I think everybody's so busy. I'm this, I'm a communist, I'm a progressive, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat. There are all these different words. And I think if people spent more time just trying to help each other and not worrying about where the differences are, we'd probably get a lot further. I guess in, the most general sense, I'm probably somewhere between a progressive and a socialist, I guess. But, the reality is that nothing's working. So whatever label is going to be the label that fits to trying to make something work is what I want to be called.
I look at myself as a pragmatist, and it doesn't matter the label to me. the country though has drifted right. You know, there's a famous meme about ratcheting to the right, and then it won't let you go
Right.
back left. That, 30 years ago, I would have considered myself a moderate. But now, my positions haven't changed, but a lot of people have, drifted so far right that, yeah, I mean, by the current definition, you would consider me on the left side. One of the things before we get into the People's Party, though, I just wanted to bring up was having spent time on uh, social media, especially Twitter, and a little bit less on Facebook. I find that a lot of times the basic problem is what I would call leftist intolerance, and that by that I mean is this group, like socialists or anarchists or social democrats, if you don't follow what they want 100%, you're part of the enemy, which to me is so self-defeating. I'll give you just two examples. Uh, 2 or 3 days ago, I saw someone, and I don't know them. They're not. I don't follow them, but it's just the same. I saw the same name being retweeted by someone was talking about uh, that they knew someone, a friend or a family member, who was getting gene therapy for something to improve themselves. And then a day or so later, the same person was like, uh, they're against eugenics. Now, we all know, well, most people should know that there's a negative history of eugenics, both in the US and worldwide with Nazism and whatnot. But what got me was in one tweet talking about fixing problems with gene therapy. That's eugenics. So there's actually good eugenics and there's bad eugenics. And on the
Hmm.
same token, there are people who, for example, I'll use the example of Bernie Sanders. Is what gets me is I wasn't a great Sanders fan. I didn't hate him. If he had stuck it out and won the Democratic nomination, I probably would have voted for him. But the people who are Sanders supporters, and now people like with the squad and Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, is they seem to, if they support them, they will not drink any criticism of it. Now you can go, if you go and making fun of AOC's looks or Bernie Sanders this or that, that's unnecessary. But what do you what do you make of what I would call this sort of leftist intolerance? That either you're with us or against us, because you're only going to get like 0.3% people 100% with you.
And I agree. I remember when AOC was raising the money for Texas
Mm-hmm.
after the power outage and everything, and people were really mad at her. Like, you should be writing bills, you should be doing policy, you should be doing this. And I remember tweeting and saying, listen, you can be mad because you feel like she's not doing the specific thing that you want her to do, but to attack her for literally raising money to help people who are struggling, to me doesn't seem like a valid
Yeah.
use of time. So I'm a firm believer that you can you can agree and you can disagree. You don't have to agree all the time. You don't have to disagree just because someone isn't 100% on board with what you think is the right thing to do. And I agree. I think it's a problem. I think the minute, people see that, well, they're not doing everything that I want them to do, all of a sudden they're the enemy. And nothing gets done that way. It'll
Yeah.
be impossible for anything to get done that way. And I wonder really sometimes if part of this is really a construct of our government. Like, keep people fighting so that you
Yeah.
can't work together.
I absolutely think it is. And like I said, I've seen it now for 30 plus decades, 30 plus years. I'm not that old. But let's then talk a little bit about the movement for People's Party. What is it, and how early in its genesis did you get involved?
So the actual movement for People's Party organization is a rollover from Draft Bernie.
Yeah.
I was not involved with Draft Bernie. I don't have any experience directly with Draft Bernie. The organization behind both of them is a 527 nonprofit. I believe it's People for Working Democracy. You'd have to go to the website to double check that. And essentially, it's the same group that has, rotated from Draft Bernie into now movement for a People's Party into what's supposed to be the actual People's Party that's going to, have a slate of candidates or whatever have you. They did a convention at the end of August last year. I was very impressed with the convention.
It was an
Mostly
online
because,
convention, though.
yes, it was an online convention, correct. And it was it was very much just this conversation about breaking the duopoly. Like,
Mhm.
you don't have to vote for Republicans or Democrats. We can start something and give people something to get behind that's really about people. So I signed up at the end of August, early September, somewhere within in that time frame. And by November, it was getting pretty clear to me that there was some problems, some disorganization, some unanswered questions for things that should have answers. And I was part of the group that was thrown out of the Slack and all the workspaces on January 12th.
Now, just so we be clear, and so no one can accuse you of slandering anyone or whatnot, you're not accusing them of any bias because of your sex or your gender or your ethnicity. Your basic complaint is that there's just fundamentally a bad leadership in terms of executing what they want, or am I wrong?
Well, so that is a large part of it. The other part is that their failure to execute and failure to lead and organize has allowed for sexism, discrimination, racism to occur within the workspace. So it's not, and I've said this on a couple of different things. This is not me saying that MPP is racist or that the leaders of MPP are racist. It's me saying that their inability to manage their workspaces created an environment where racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these things existed within their workspace and went unchecked. And people who spoke out were ultimately at times removed.
Was this more based on, oh, I'm the leader of the Denver office and cronyism within the Denver office, let's say, or was it more or less just a lack of leadership at the very upper top of the top 10 or 12 people who might form the council or whatever?
It was a lack of leadership at the top.
Yeah.
They continuously said that they just didn't have enough time, people, ability to monitor the Slack workspace properly. So these things happened because it was impossible to actually fully moderate the Slack. The issue was they had a system in place that would have done the moderation, but they removed the people who were in charge of that working group to do that, and then decided that it wasn't necessary anymore. So they left the Slack open to this type of, assault, and they weren't really interested in fixing it. And, the word is that they're supposedly going to do a vote to see if they'll, bring the regenerative culture working group back. I don't really know if that's going to happen, but I'm no longer involved with the organization.
So did they even have a 50-state strategy in terms of getting candidates on? Because I know I had done a little series of a handful of interviews last year with some of the minor party candidates from, well, basically the only ones I didn't have was anyone from the MPP. I know they weren't running a candidate, but I did ask to speak to someone. And then the Green Party, Howie Hawkins, and I even tried Daria Hunter, but neither of them were interested either. So in regards to the leadership, are we talking the fellow's name? Who's the guy who actually started it? This Branna is his name?
Yes, Nick Branna.
Nick Branna. So he was. What was his background? Was he was he like a disaffected Green, or do you know?
So, all right. So he worked for the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016.
Okay.
His actual title and role with Bernie Sanders is questionable. I'm not going to get into detail about that because there seems to be multiple versions of what exactly he did with that campaign. He's in Virginia. I believe he also worked for another state campaign at one point or another. But his actual history of fully organizing, I don't know that there's a clear here are all the things that he did that would qualify him to start an actual political major party.
Uh-huh. Um, when I first encountered you a few days back online, I had mentioned that I have been a long-term Green supporter. I voted for a few other little minor parties here and there when there wasn't a Green available or something. And I don't know if you, I had mentioned how Howie Hawkins, who was the Green nominee last year for president, how he was doing what I call minor league Hillary tactics in terms of basically just trying to weed out any dissent. And, as bad as it is to see how Hillary ran her 2016 campaign, and Biden was maybe a little bit more slick than Hillary was in terms of shutting Bernie Sanders down. But it's almost comical that a party like the Greens that has not even been able to maintain 5%. We can talk about ranked choice voting and other ways to wedge in there to break up the duopoly, as you call it. But that a party that has had decades of failure to even maintain themselves, even the libertarians do better than them, by the way, how they could act in such, I mean, you have such a minor fiefdom, and you want to cut out any voices of dissent. And it sounds to me like, in a sense, the Movement for a People's Party didn't even have the decades of establishment that the Greens did, and was starting to do some of the same things that I would say Howie Hawkins was doing, these Hillary-like elements. Is that fair? And without naming names, is there any one edict that came down that you can point to as, oh, in October they wanted us to do this?
Well, I mean, there's a few. They announced an advisory council. No one was aware of there being, if this even being a thing that was being discussed. It was presented to the volunteers in the Slack at the same time. Actually, it was presented to the volunteers in the Slack after it was presented to the public on social media. When people asked, where did this come from? How is this decided? Why is this? How did we decide that this was going to be the group that was going to represent us? One of the National Coordinating Circle members basically sent a letter in Slack that said, this is something we've been working on for a long time. This is how we do things. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And so that was an interesting response to what I thought was a reasonable set of questions about, naming a group of people to represent another group of people when the larger group didn't have anything to do with the selection process. Force the vote was something similar. When Force the Vote happened, again, the people in Slack who were the active volunteers found out after the public found out that, Movement for a People's Party was going to be participating in Force the Vote. So these are the things that happen. We, the membership would be told, and I use the term membership very, very lightly because there's nothing that determines what an actual member of the party is. But, when the CC, the National Council, the National Coordinating Circle made a decision, they made the decision. It was on Zoom. It was between them. They don't keep notes. They don't have a record of how they make decisions. There's no way to backtrack or verify what the conversation was. And they send edicts down, and this is what we're going to do now. And they do at times these, fake votes to make it look like the volunteers have some say and the people have some say, but the decisions typically are already made. And this is just what happens. When I signed up, one of the things that I was most, impressed by was this idea that it was really going to be the local effort. There were going to be hubs. It was going to be, self-operating systems. It was going to be horizontal, and all of these things in late November just disappeared. It was no longer the case. That's not what we're doing anymore. But nobody talked about it. No one said anything. No one said we're looking at changing the organizational structure. They just changed it. And, for me, that's a really big bait and switch. You brought a lot of people in with the assumption that it was going to be a horizontal structure, and then you just decided it wasn't going to be anymore without telling
I know when I had contacted the website of MPP to just find out what they're about and maybe interview someone there, I asked, so what is the strategy going forward? They weren't going to run anyone in the 20s. So I said, so were you planning on a local
anybody.
slate of candidates in Columbus, Ohio, Jacksonville, Florida, whatever, around the country? Were you targeting any, was there any kind of strategy? And I never got any answer back from that, and just seeing tweets from different things, it just seemed there wasn't. So you can then confirm there wasn't any strategy to like get people to compete on a local level and then sort of after 3 or 4 election cycles work your way up to running a presidential candidate. Is that correct?
No, no.
No.
The strategy, which has already completely failed, was that they were going to earn ballot access in all 50 states by the end of 2020. They were going to run congressional candidates in 2022, and they were going to run someone for president in 2024.
Uh-huh.
That was the stated goal and mission. That was what the sell was, and it's, my understanding now, it's now March 2021. They've started the process to gain ballot access in 3 states. They're supposedly starting in a 4th. There is no confirmed ballot access anywhere in the country. They're supposedly pulling together a slate of candidates to run in 2022, but those candidates are being selected by the national circle. It's not a local effort. So states are not going to be the ones who decide which candidates they're supporting for whatever reason. And then I guess they think if they run 12 to 15 old ex-Democrats who ran in deep blue places where Bernie was popular, that they might be able to win a few of those seats so that they can put some people in Congress so that they have representation when they run for president in 2024. That's my understanding of the plan.
And I just looked earlier today before we spoke on the website, and I saw someone said, maybe it wasn't on the website, maybe it was on the Twitter page, that we can replace the Democratic Party. We want to replace the Democratic Party, which to me, we want something better than the Democratic Party. Otherwise, why replace them?
Right, but replacing the Democratic Party means it's still a duopoly.
Yeah.
It's just between MVP and the Republicans now.
Yeah.
You don't, replacing the Democratic Party is not helpful. You want to give people another option.
Right.
And one of the things that I felt strongly about was, we have these arguments about Trump supporters. Like, we don't want to talk to Trump. Well, why wouldn't you want to talk to a Trump supporter? Not every Trump supporter is like, this crazy racist person who like, it's not a monolith. They're not all thinking the same thing. And at the same time, listen, if I'm part of a protest and I see a white man in a Hawaiian shirt carrying an Uzi, I'm not going to go up to that person to see if they're like the random boogaloo boy who's not racist. I'm not going there. But I'm also not going to say that every single boogaloo boy is racist. I'm just not taking that chance. If someone else wants to take it, that's fine. But I feel like there are conversations that you have to have with people to determine, what's important, because everything has to be on an individual person-to-person level so that you can determine what people's needs are so that you can actually focus on getting people what they need. This idea that you're just going to take over one of the parties is not going to be helpful. What you should be doing is figuring out which of the Republicans really are Republicans because they're sick of the Democrats.
Yeah.
And which of the Democrats are Democrats because that's just what they've been doing forever. And even though they don't agree, they've gone along with the blue no matter who. Yeah. And then you also target, people who don't vote, which is a huge portion of the people in the country. And if you can gather enough people, you can have an effect. You can have another party. You can have, someone who is actually to the left of, whatever we're calling progressive, social democrats, whatever it is, who might be willing to speak up. But, it's the government is set up to prevent this very thing from happening. So trying to go in and take over one portion of the government is not going to, that's a bad strategy.
Yeah, vote shaming is the term that comes to mind, and I'll get into it before we close the show. I'll give you an example. I live in Texas, and I think there are a lot of Trump supporters that if you actually talk with them and you tell them what these things are about, they actually are like, oh yeah, it would be good if I didn't have to pay for medicine all the time. It would be good. That they actually do support the policies if they are explained right. But people on the left, and certainly the moderate Democrats, they don't want to because it's easier to demonize them. I mean, I'll get to this a little bit later, but even vote shaming when it comes to, you must vote. Well, if I'm voting for the mayor of my town and the mayor is a corrupt grifter, his opponent is an ex-Klansman, and the third party person is, a freaky, I don't know, Marianne Williamson type on steroids, and I say, well, I've got the crook, the racist, or the wacko. I'm not voting. To me, that seems like that's actually, that's their right to do that. But to say, oh, you're not a real American, turns people off.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who don't vote simply because the choices suck.
Right.
Like, they don't want to waste their time or take a day off of work or be stressed out standing in line for 3 hours to pick between two morons. Like,
right.
I don't know any situation in which that's like the stellar, like, who wants to do that?
Right.
Now, I'll admit, I vote shamed my husband. I was like, you have to go vote. I don't care. Do what you want to do. You have to go vote because we have a 10-year-old and I want him to learn that, like, you have very few powers in life and your vote is one of those very few powers and you should use it. Yeah. That said, I also told him, listen, if you really don't want to go vote, we can sit down and talk to, our little one about it and have like a conversation about why you're not voting. But there are plenty of people who don't vote because, they've lived on the same street for 30 years and no matter who's in government, you can't drive down their street because it's unpaved and it's got potholes. And they know that no matter who's in there, it's not going to make a difference. So why are they going to bother? Yeah. And this is something that needs to be addressed. People need to be able to talk about policy and change when it's not during a voting cycle.
Right.
And that's what the problem is. People only want to talk to voters when they're looking for a vote. How about you talk to voters when you're trying to figure out what they need? And then maybe they'll actually go vote because you had a conversation with them when you didn't need their vote.
Yeah, I know. My wife voted for Biden last year, and I was like, and now she's sort of regretting it. But on the other hand, I'm like, but she wanted to get Trump out so badly. But I'm not going to tell her what to vote for. I said though, but you can vote. For example, I did some interviews, as I said, with some minor party candidates. Well, I wasn't going to vote for Biden or Trump. Howie Hawkins turned me off as the year went on with some of his shenanigans. And so, of the two people I interviewed. Of the 5 candidates I interviewed, a couple were okay. The guy running on the Prohibition Party, if you want a joke, want a real laugh, watch my video with the Prohibition candidate. Never has a more incoherent interview ever been done. But but I came down. I wanted to vote for Mark Charles, who was a Native American running. I interviewed him. I found, even though I disagreed with a few of his things, I found him to be a person of integrity. But in Texas, I couldn't even write him in because if I wrote in a candidate who was not even allowed to be written in, my whole vote would have been cast away. So I ended up voting for Gloria La Riva, who was the socialist running with Peltier as her VP. And then I said to some people, don't give me this stuff about him being a murderer. I said, whether or not he's a murderer, every goddamn president who's ever been is a mass murderer, from Washington to Obama or up to Trump. So, Renee, one of the things that before we get to the MPP, it's come out recently, and I think anyone with a brain who even follows politics in a minor way. The Lincoln Project last year, which was an anti-Trump group of Republicans, to me was one of the biggest grifts. And in the last 2 or 3 weeks here, some of their financial misdoings, some sexual harassment claims and things of that nature have come to light. And I'm not comparing the Movement for People's Party with them in terms of degree, certainly not. But I always had the feeling, especially after several emails to try to interview someone with the party, that there was this feeling that we're doing something special, and you're too little for us. And I got the sense that they were more invested in getting celebrity endorsements than they were in getting little people like you and me working for them. And let me just give you a few names here. And I know you weren't up in the upper echelons, but let me just throw these out and give my observations and then ask yours. Uh, Certainly, there's a fellow a comedian named Jimmy Dore who has his own online show, and he was one of the big vocal supporters. Cornel West was probably the biggest name in terms of political clout or presence. Then there's Jesse Ventura, who I worked during the Ventura years. I was living up in Minnesota, and so I've never been a big fan of him. I loved him as a wrestler, but not as a politician. And then the other person, and I'll start with him, was this podcaster named Ryan Knight. Now, I never heard of him until last year when he was tweeting stuff out, and I'm not saying anything bad against him, but he always, to me, seemed sort of like the slick Madison Avenue type. And from when I looked up on him, I guess he was he's a reformed neoliberal. And
Yes.
all the tweets that were coming from his Twitter account were, to me, even if he was supporting a position I supported, I got the feeling that this was just a Madison Avenue. It's hard to define unless I went through hundreds of his tweets. So I just threw out a handful of names. Do you have any comment on any of these, whether it's Storr or Knight or Jesse or Cornel West?
Yeah. So, the celebrity support thing is tricky because the reality is the idea and the thought that is behind MPP is really a good one. You know what I mean? It's something that the country does need, right? We need the ability to vote for someone who is not completely on board with the duopoly. We need we need people to vote for who, aren't in bed with banks and big pharma and the things that make government not work for the people. So I do firmly believe that all of these people who got on board because the idea is a good one. Because in theory, doing what MPP presents themselves as doing is a good thing. The problem is, I don't know how many of these people are really clear on the actual ability for MPP to do what it is promising to do. And that's where the problem comes in. So, it's difficult. It's very, very difficult because, and I don't want to disparage anybody, right? But I've tried to communicate with some of these people on the advisory council via Twitter, via email, because I think it's important that they get the feedback from volunteers like me and other people who were within the organizational walls and can see where all the cracks are. It's hard to do that. No one responds, no one listens. Look, I'm a peon. Like, who's paying attention to the regular, woman from Brooklyn who's complaining? But, at times I feel like if they really took a step back and really looked at what was happening, I don't know that they would continue to support this organization that's really, to what I can see, I don't see how they can achieve the mission that they stated. Now, Ryan Knight has already stepped back.
Yeah.
Publicly stepped back. I've talked to Ryan. He's a nice guy. I don't know him personally. I've known him for years. But he saw whatever he saw and he decided, I don't want to be in the forefront of this anymore. They had a couple of advisory council people who stepped back for a variety of reasons. And, in the end, I agree with you. I think they're way more focused on getting popular and, big names and famous people to support them than they are in supporting their actual volunteers to do the local efforts that would be the thing that would actually get them to their mission.
Yeah.
Like, Jimmy Dore is funny. I don't particularly like follow him. Every now and again, I've seen some things. My mother's a big fan, but I'm not a big Jimmy Dore follower. But I also, I don't see Jimmy Dore going on the street and gathering signatures with the local hub for California. Like, I just don't see that happening. So yeah, it's great to have somebody with a big name to say, like, oh, I'm going to support, but you need the local people. And if you're not giving the local people the same attention that you're giving the popular people, I don't see how anything's going to get done.
Well, I know I mentioned that to me, Ryan Knight looked like a reform neoliberal. There are other what we would call reform neoliberals. I think of two that come to mind. That one's on Twitter regularly that I see, and maybe the other one not as much. One is this fellow Peter Daou, and then there's also Robert Reich, who used to be, I think, the finance secretary under, was it Clinton? Yep. And he seems to have moved even further left in his. So it would seem to me that these are guys I'd rather be plucking as plums to give you organizational advice rather than Jesse Ventura, who, like I said, I'm curious, he's a nice enough guy personally, but he left Minnesota a disaster when he was a governor. Or someone like the Jimmy Dores or even Cornel West. Really, he's more of a theoretician. He's not a practical on the grounds guy who could give you advice on this is how we're going to win that county in upstate New York and win the county in Ohio. Was there ever, as far as you know, any outreach to some of these famous figures who are putatively leftist that maybe disaffected Democrats or whatnot?
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there were a couple of names that I heard floated around via other people who used to be in the coordinating circle, who were probably more on the side of, Peter Dow or Robert Reich. And I don't think the party had much interest. The powers that be had much interest in reaching out to those people.
If I use a metaphor, from what you said, it sounds almost like kids who, instead of going to, say, a local music teacher to learn how to play their instruments better, maybe said, well, we're just a local garage band, and we're just going to play our music, and we're going to be cool. I mean, it sounds more like there was more ego rather than actual intelligence.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I mean,
yeah.
It's hard to defend the plan. I was part of the New York hub, and in New York, one of the things that bothers me the most about this whole conversation is every time I hear an interview with regard to NPP and ballot access, the conversation is always about signatures, right? We're going to get the signatures. We're going to get the signatures. We're going to get the signatures, which is great in a state where that's a thing, right? So in a state like New York, signatures are not a thing. New York is one of 11 states where you have to run someone for governor in order to get ballot access for president. There's no other way around it. And not only do you have to run someone, the person that you run has to get either 2% or 130,000 votes, which is a lot. So if you're running an organization that's supposedly pursuing ballot access in all 50 states, in November of 2020, when I asked the question, okay, what's going to happen here? Because you have to run someone for governor. And at the time, all the sexual assault things hadn't come out about Cuomo, the whole book issue and him killing people in nursing homes hadn't come up. So none of this information had been available at the time. So he was relatively popular enough and had enough financial backing that he would have been a tough race for anybody to come in and run. So in November of 2020, you should already be formulating a plan for who you're running for governor in 2022 in New York in order to ensure that you can try and gain ballot access for 2024.
Yeah.
The answer was we might know in about 6 months when I asked, what's the plan? And so to me, that means you're not serious because it's Cuomo, it's New York. How do you not have the beginnings of a plan that you can share with your local volunteers within the state? And as to my knowledge, as of the last meeting in New York about ballot access, which was like maybe a month ago, they still didn't have an answer. And it was stated by the person who was running the political outreach that, we should have done more research. We don't think New York's going to be doable. It's New York. Like, I mean, not, I know I'm like, the narcissistic New Yorker to be like, it's New York, but it's New York. Like, how do you not have a plan for New York? It's mind boggling to me.
Yeah. So let's get a little bit more general. I want to talk a little bit about your opinions about the future of leftist or progressive policies. Because my guess is your belief would probably be that MPP is probably going to wither on the vine. Is that you don't see necessarily a viable future for them unless they were to totally change?
Yeah, I mean they've got to do something about this failure to focus on local organizing. It's an absolute failure to try and do a countrywide national effort when you're not participating in seriously in local action.
So I mentioned earlier about living in Texas, and I live in the Austin area, and just west of Austin is what's known as the Hill Country. It's one of the few hilly parts of Texas, and you of course have hillbilly types out there. There are people who literally live in 600-foot not vans, motorhomes or whatnot, and they're poor as sin. And these are people that, with the exception of maybe having religious opinions about something, are ripe for the plucking for someone with what you would call social democratic or socialist or progressive views. Because I've worked with some of these people. My wife and I are artists, so I've worked all kinds of jobs, from working at AT&T years ago to working in a supermarket as I am now, to doing all kinds of physical labor. We're fortunate in one sense in that both of us have jobs where we haven't been let go, but we're being worked to death. That's why I'm home now for the couple of weeks with a hernia. It's 3 years of doing a 2-person job. But when I worked, for example, at a local school district, and I was in between jobs working as a custodian, I remember when Trump got elected, a lot of the people, they were shouting, hooray, Trump got elected. And these were people who were not making shit for wages. And yet I asked them, well, what do you support about Trump? Well, he's for America. And I said, well, what do you want? And I would talk to them, and we'd go down a list of things like, do you think that medical care should be paid for by your taxes and be less? Yes, they're for that. They're for not having their kids, because some of them had kids who were in debt that they were able to send to college. And if the 60+% approval of a lot of what would be considered leftist policies, they probably support 80% of it. And so what do you think is the general failure in this country to unite poor people, white poor people, whether they're living in inner cities? I was, a working class boy in New York. People think when inner city, they say must be black or Hispanic, but no, there are more poor white people by the number than any other group in this goddamn country. And I'm not even getting into the Native Americans who are being left to rot on their reservations with COVID. But that's for another story. Why is it so difficult, do you think, to be able to unite all of these people? Because you said you're from New York. I grew up in New York my first 26 years. You and I are going to have a lot more in common, despite being a black woman and a white man who's 56. We're going to have a lot more in common than you or I are going to have with some guy out in Nebraska. Or, why is it so difficult, do you think, just your own personal view?
I think it's the construct, right? Like everything, and it's tricky because you can't ever really leave out race when you have these conversations, because the entire system was built on race, right? It was built on the construct of white people owning black people and using that to grow, you know, capitalism. Like, so you can't leave that part out. But at the same time, and this is something that I have such a hard time getting people to understand, the the reason that white supremacy and all the constructs that were built on top of it are thriving is because government has been able to add all these other constructs to keep people separate, like classism and, you know, sexism and ageism and ableism. And there are all these different things that make people feel like they don't have anything in common with someone else. When the reality is, we're all just people and everybody needs to eat, everybody needs to have access to water, everybody needs somewhere warm and dry to sleep, everyone needs, you know, the ability to make enough money that they can pay for whatever that they need to survive. Like the basic needs of every person, it's not different. There's no difference between what the person in Nebraska who thinks they don't agree with me, or wherever who thinks they don't agree with me. I picked Nebraska because that was the state you said.
Yeah.
You know, there's no different. There's nothing different that they need to survive that I also don't need to survive. The problem is that everybody's so worried about the differences in who I am versus who that person are that they miss that.
Uh-huh.
And it's really it's a difficult line to cross because some people are very attached to those differences. Like some people hold on to white privilege so tightly that they don't want to have a conversation about, you know, anything else. And it's difficult, but that's what it is. You know, there are constructs in place, there are things, systems in place that are intentionally built to prevent regular people from being able to acknowledge that there's really no difference between us.
Yeah.
And that's where the problem is.
I want to give you a little anecdote. It just came to me as you were talking. With all this stuff you mentioned, Boogaloo Boys and these white power groups and these yokels, you know, that stormed the Capitol, and I would say that that kind of racism is not the real thing that keeps people down. And I want to give you an example. When we talk about white privilege, a lot of white people say, "Well, I'm not privileged," but let me give you an example of what I would call white privilege. And some people may get offended. But I hope I don't offend you. But let me give you an example. I lived up in Minnesota for a dozen years, from 91 to 03. Minnesota was very backwards racially then. They would, in the 90s, they would talk about people who were mulattoes and quadroons. So this is Minnesota in the 90s. But I had a friend, and unfortunately I have to say had, the past tense, because I haven't been in touch with him the last 5 years. We just sort of drifted apart. And he was a good, decent man, a white fella, a few years older than me. He had 2 degrees in science, master's degrees, I believe. And he called himself a yellow dog Democrat. I'll vote for a yellow dog who runs on the Democratic side rather than a Republican. And he gave to all the charities. He'd never used the N word. He'd never talk about, you know, use other disparaging terms or whatnot. But let me give you an example of the white privilege that he had that he didn't even know he had. So one day we're out. This was before both of us are married, and we saw a movie or something, and afterwards we're out, and for some reason the topic came up of when we were dating, and I said, "So have you ever dated like someone who wasn't white?" Because I dated a few black girls, a few Hispanic, a couple of East Asian, I guess you'd call it. And he's like, "Oh no," and I said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Well, I don't find black women attractive." I said, "What do you mean you don't find black women attractive?" And he said, "Well, you know, I just the look and whatnot." And I said, "Hold on. So you're telling me that if you came home and you went to your bedroom to change and Halle Berry was there and she said, 'Come to me, honey,' you wouldn't be on it?" He said, "Well, blah, 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 blah. Of course, but that's Halle Berry." And I said, "So Halle Berry isn't black?" He said, "Well, you know what I mean." And so I said, "Well, what do you mean when you say you aren't attracted to black?" So he started describing, you know, what he didn't find attractive. And I said, "Now I get it. You don't want to fuck Aunt Jemima." Because that was his default image of a black woman in his mind, was someone with big round hips, you know, dark, middle-aged, I guess she was initially. And when I explained this to him, he's like, it dawned on him, I think, but it never had dawned on him before that his default image of this person, a black female, was someone that was a stereotype. Because when confronted with, the sex siren, screen goddess Halle Berry, or even just an average, typical black woman, he still would default to this stereotype. And that's the kind of thing that I think is far more dangerous, because this fellow, he wasn't in any positions of power, but let's say he was a middle manager of an office, and he's carrying that in his mind set. That, forget about wanting to bed Halle Berry. You got three people up for review. One of them's a black woman, one of them's a white guy, and another one's, a Filipino. You're going to go in there with this negative stereotype about this person. And it never dawns on him. And to me, that is more insidious and is harder to eradicate than the Boogaloo Boy. So that's my idea of what white privilege is, not even knowing that you have that kind of privilege. And just aside from the MPP order, have you met, or I'm sure you've dealt or encountered those kinds of situations too, in different degrees, of course, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it's difficult because there's also an extreme, right? Like your friend that you just described, he probably wouldn't have been fair to the black woman coming into the interview, but he also wouldn't have been seeking to physically harm her, right? Yeah. So that, when I made the comment I did about the Boogaloo Boys, that's something that I always want people to understand. People talk often about, look what the Black Panthers did in Chicago, back in the 70s. And I'm like, yes, but they literally got the white racist people to say, I'm going to stop thinking in this way so that I can work towards this coalition. There's a line that has to be crossed, and that line requires, as a black person, me to physically put myself in potential harm, in order to cross that line. So, these conversations often, I think, that small nuance of understanding that there's not just mental stress and harm that comes with this, that there's potential for actual physical harm that can come with the problem. And, I think people miss that sometimes. And it's a hard thing. I have a son, and to ask me to put myself or to put him at risk to try and cross a barrier, I'm not doing that. And I will pass on the opportunity to maybe get someone who's really alt-right to change their mind, to make sure that I don't get harmed and that my child doesn't get harmed. Now, people will say, well, that's not reasonable. Like, that person, maybe could have made a real difference. And I encourage them to go talk to that person. I'm not saying anybody else shouldn't do it. I'm just not going to be the one to try. And, white privilege is a tricky thing. I try to explain sometimes. I have a great deal of white friends and people who I love dearly, who I've known my entire life. And, the one thing I always remind people is, you always, no matter what classification of anything else you are as a white person, if you're rich, if you're poor, if you, there's so many different things that can come into place. None of that is going to be seen over being white, right? Like, I'm going to be black no matter what room I walk into. It's something I can't hide. I can't, if I'm black and rich versus black and poor, I'm still black.
Yeah.
If you're a poor white person, you can hide being poor, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can figure out a way to walk into a room and to not have someone see you as anything other than a white, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
And that's the part of privilege that I think people don't understand. I can't escape my skin, period. So that's always going to be part of the equation.
So I'm short-term pessimistic about the future. Long-term, I'm optimistic. With things like global warming, for example, what really frustrates me is this, to me, existentially, should be the biggest issue. People who think we're going to end up like the planet Venus or something don't know science. what I can tell from the best estimates is we probably already passed the point of no return. We're going to have to get ready for the next 100 years and basically have all these nations mobilized as if World War III, but World War III to restore the planet, have that kind of an effort. And I think I don't see it coming in the next 10, 12 years. I just don't see the will there. And I see future generations being damned. And what this is going to do, it will exacerbate tensions, whether it's ethnically within countries. It's going to exacerbate tensions between the rich and the poor countries. And I think short term, in the next 50 years, meaning short term, it's things are going to be hairy here. And I don't think global warming in and of itself is going to kill the human species off, but battles over resources could be a thing that is triggered by that could do us off. But if we get over that, I think hopefully our descendants will look at us the same way we look at people who own slaves or people who committed genocide. And I said to many people, in 100 years, people are going to probably look at us at the way we treated animals, eat animals, and factory farms, and they're going to say, "What the fuck was wrong with them?" The same way we look at, and I'm not a vegan or a vegetarian. I'm just saying that, what is your, just as a person, what is your short-term view of what's going to happen in the next decade or two? And do you have hope for your son, for example? When he's 70 or 80 years old, that things will be better than it was for you.
Um, I don't honestly, I don't know. I don't know. I agree with you that things are very bleak right now. I think probably, the pressure and the damage that we're causing to the planet is not going to turn around fast enough. I think my son and this next generation that's coming is going to bear the weight of all the damage that we've already done. Do I hope that things get better? Absolutely. But I look around and it's been 50 odd going on 60 years since I mean more than that since the civil rights movement, and things aren't much better now. Like they're a little bit better
Yeah.
incrementally, like but there's a lot of stuff that's still the same. So you have to wonder, like, how much you can't even bank on 50, 60 years things have to really change, because things haven't really changed.
Yeah. I mean, why the hell does the Voters' Rights Act have to be renewed every so often? I mean, it's
right. And simple stuff like people say, well, lynchings don't happen anymore, and I'm like, okay, but Ahmaud Arbery was running down the street and he got like cornered by 3 white men and killed. Like, there are things that haven't really changed. It's just it's a hard thing to face, and I struggle with this. I look at my son and I really worry. I worry about what his future is going to be like. I worry about the things that he's going to have to deal with. I worry about the things that he's going to encounter as he grows up. And I want him to be able to grow up and to be happy and healthy, and to just be able to pursue the things that he loves in life so that he can find a way to survive. But I can't see the future.
Yeah.
Do I want it to happen? Will I do everything in my power to make sure that he has, access to the things that he needs in order for him to get there? Sure, but I really don't know. I don't know.
How about you personally? Are you turned off from activism because of this experience with MPP, or are you going to look into the Socialists or the Green Party, or what?
So, I'm not turned off from activism, because I feel like we are the only people who can change anything. You can't rely on the government. You can't rely on, you just can't. They are not about helping people. So what I am looking at is very local actions. There's a hospital in Brooklyn that Cuomo has set his sights on to close down so that they can build more housing, which, another apartment building over a hospital, I don't know why that would be the choice. So I've been working with a group to try and stop the closure of that hospital. I've been working with another group of people who are trying to figure out what's the best way to, really encourage local actions and helping people to improve their situations, working with another person because we're trying to, figure out, is there some way that we can set something up to help organize organizations so that their spaces are safe for their volunteers, so that people don't live through what I've now gone through with multiple organizations, and so no, I'm not going to give up on activism, not in any way, shape, or form. I may give up on joining some larger body that's planning this national plan that's not a good one.
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I'm moving. I'm hopefully going to be moving here in the next couple of months, and once I figure out where I'm going to land, I'm probably just going to register as an independent and then kind of go from there and not do this whole political, like, electoral nonsense. It's just, it's got to be local.
Yeah,
it's got everything that has to be local.
It's the same thing when I work at my job, and it's just, politics are like, it's like corporations. You will never succeed if you are waging war, or you are executing a strategy from the top down. It has to be from the bottom up, because the guy on the front lines knows more than the general 100 miles back, no matter how much the general thinks he knows. But anyway, it was a pleasure talking to you, Renee, and I wish you the best, and hopefully we'll never have to have this conversation again. But I think a lot of people are going to have similar conversations. But anyway, again, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.